Who are the agencies? Obviously, the Department of Environmental Protection and the water management districts are principally involved in protecting the springs. The Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services also has a role in controlling the pollutants that come from agriculture. So I want to talk first about the Basin Management Action Plans. BMAPs are associated with total maximum daily loads. That's a TMDL, and the TMDL is dictated by the Clean Water Act. It's a requirement of the Clean Water Act. But BMAPs are not. BMAPs are under state law only. So we've looked at that and concluded that EPA has no real role in our BMAP process. So I want to talk a little bit about the lower and middle Suwannee experience. This is an ongoing matter that the Florida Springs Council is involved in. I'm calling this cooperation in the age of faux resource protection because really under the current administration and really probably the last 20 years, what we've seen is statements about protecting resources, but no protection of resources that we can really look to and expect from these administrations. So the BMAP program is an important program. I think it's a program that we all should be looking to as a primary driver to clean up the springs and their primarily nitrate problem. So we've reviewed some BMAPs and finally got our act together, and we're starting to engage in the BMAP process with the Department of Environmental Protection, which is responsible for that program. So I have a slide that includes what challenges are faced by the BMAP program. And this slide basically identifies, and this is slide 3, please. This slide basically identifies and summarizes what the requirements are for a valid BMAP. And as we've looked at them, what we see is that the important things, what we think are the most important things, this is a plan that's supposed to provide a roadmap so that within 20 years, and I know that's a long time, I don't feel comfortable with 20 years, but I think these processes, some of them will require 20 years, but the BMAP is intended to establish a map with milestones that will get us within 20 years back to where we need to be. Now, with respect to the springs, the standard for nitrogen is 0.35 milligrams per liter. Many of the springs are outstanding Florida waters, and really the expectation with respect to OFWs is that they should never be degraded from the time they're established. Those levels of nutrients in those waters should not ever be lowered. Unfortunately, they have been lowered. And so to get back to where those water quality standards were, we have already accepted that they're only going to come back to 0.35 milligrams per liter under the TMDL program, even though greater improvement is really required, in my opinion, under the OFW standards. So the important things about a roadmap are milestones. And the BMAP program requires that milestones be established at least on a 5-year basis and looked at every 5 years. So we should have, in a BMAP, we should have identified what is going to be done specifically to bring those levels of pollutants down, and when is that going to happen? After 5 years, where are we going to be? After 10 years, where are we going to be? And after 20 years, we better be where we're supposed to be. So in order to evaluate those, you need to have a good water quality monitoring that is associated with each of the activities that are required under the BMAP that's adopted. BMAPs are adopted on a basin basis, So we look at the basin and we say, okay, where are we going to be what are we going to do in the next 5 years, and where are we going to be? And we're going to monitor that. So that's the important elements in a BMAP. The other thing that's important is looking at not just what the loading is currently, but what additional loading is expected based on our projections of land use primarily. So we looked at the BMAP for the lower and middle Swanee, and basically what we find in that BMAP is that agriculture is the biggest challenge. And really, EPA has established and stated that, contrary to popular belief of the stewardship of agriculture, agriculture is the biggest polluter at this point in time. The Clean Water Act has done a very good job, in my opinion, of getting point source discharges under control, but BMAPs are really primarily looking at non-point source pollution. That's any kind of pollution that typically in Florida is driven by rain into the ground, for our purposes. So pollutants are driven into the ground primarily by rain, and that's non-point source pollution. So as we look at the lower and middle Swanee BMAP, we come to the conclusion that for springs protection, the main thing that needs to be done is we need to control fertilizer, an agricultural application of fertilizer. Turning to slide 2, the unfortunate thing that we find as we look at the law is that agriculture is pretty much exempt. The Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services is charged with developing best management practices. You've heard about BMPs. And in the initial BMAPs, all that agriculture has to do is the BMPs. So they have to sign up and get approval from from FDACs for the BMPs that are appropriate for their particular agricultural practice. And then subsequently, in subsequent BMAPs, if those BMPs have not been successful, then DACS needs to go back and look at improving the BMPs. The benefit to farmers of participating in the BMP program is that they become, they're basically firewalled off from everything. Nobody can get their hands on them, and they're good to go. So the problem with the program is that it relies on science and modeling that looks primarily at nearby surface waters and doesn't really look at loading to groundwater. The compliance with the BMPs is basically voluntary until there is a BMAP in place. And then once there is a BMAP in place, all they have to do is BMPs. And basically, those of you that were here yesterday heard that DACS isn't even really getting into what fertilizer is being used, how much of it is being used, whether it's being used consistently with BMPs. Once an agricultural operation is signed up, it's basically a matter of trust that they're going to only use the fertilizer that's necessary. And so the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services is doing very little to monitor what's happening with fertilizer. So that's a big problem that we have. I want to talk a little bit about minimum flows. We're moving from water quality to water quantity. Minimum flows and levels was back in the 80s and early 90s. We thought that minimum flows and levels were going to be the be-all and end-all. They were going to put a cap on water use, because a minimum flow or level is that flow or level at which further withdrawals would be harmful. And so we thought that meant that once they allocated the water resource in a basin, that they would stop issuing permits. Unfortunately, the MFL law was turned on its ear. Slide 4, please. And now, the adoption of an MFL means they can keep issuing permits. So in some ways, I used to really want MFLs. Now I'm not so happy. I don't really want MFLs anymore because it's basically, before there's an MFL adopted, we can assert that the next groundwater withdrawal is going to cause harm, and so it can't be issued. With an MFL, they say, no, we can issue the permit, and we just have to have a recovery strategy. The recovery strategy doesn't even have to be contemporaneous with groundwater withdrawal. So I call it the kind of the Wimpy Burger theory. Those of you that are of my vintage might remember the Wimpy cartoon. Will you give me a hamburger today and I'll gladly pay you tomorrow? This is kind of what's happening with groundwater. Give me a permit today and I'll gladly recover the resource tomorrow. So there's not going to be good contemporaneous action, and that's what we're concerned about. So under MFLs, we do have a peer review mechanism. We can challenge any assumption, any model, any data that's used in the development of an MFL. And that gives us an important remedy that I think I encourage you to look to. This is before any challenge, and it's not challenging everything. It's not a full rule challenge. It's just a process where each side gets to hire or participate in the hiring of experts who will review what's been done, and it gives us a good opportunity to challenge an MFL without the full-blown rule challenge process.